Everybody. In Myth and Symbol, View back here. I just want to talk a little bit about monsters. I decided to go ahead and record this lecture so that people that missed class wouldn't miss out on this. It's extra work for me to do this. It takes a lot of time out of my planning, but I just feel like it's important for those of you who missed that one time that we're together each week that you have some explanation of kind of what the lecture was all about, because really in this class this week, I lecture for a good hour or so on monsters. And so it's kind of, I think, important. Hopefully this lecture won't be quite that long, because as usual, I do ask a lot of questions and have students think, and those things take a little bit longer. But as you know, you read Jeffrey Cohen's 7 monster theses. And those theses are right here on the PowerPoint. I'm going to go through those in sort of some detail and just give you some examples of where we see those things playing out in monsters historically, just to give you a little bit more insight on folklore that is about monsters and mythology that is about monsters. What I'm hoping you guys can do with both the semiotics and the monster analysis work that we're doing is then once we start to read mythology, you'll be able to apply both semiotic analysis to certain things and also this idea of otherness and difference that is within monster theory, and just see how those things sort of are valuable and benefit us in our analysis of the literature upcoming. So when we talk about monsters, here are Cohen's 7 theses. So this is a perfect way to kick off spooky season, since this week is October 1st and I love Halloween and all this fun stuff. So I love talking about monsters. I think monster theory is so cool. So here are the theses. The monster's body is a cultural body. The monster always escapes. The monster is a harbinger for category crisis. The monster dwells at the gates of difference. The monster polices the borders of the possible. Fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. And the monster stands at the threshold of becoming. Okay. All right, let's see if I can move there we go. Okay. I'm going to go through each of these individually for you. So the monster's body is a cultural body. In these slides, I just picked out one of Cohen's quotes that I think most encapsulates or gives us the main idea for this. So this quote says, "The monster's body quite literally incorporates fear, desire, anxiety, and fantasy, giving them life and an uncanny independence. The monster exists only to be read, that which reveals, that which warns. Like a letter on the page, the monster signifies. There's that semiotic language again. The monster signifies something other than itself. It means something. It's symbolic. It is always a displacement, okay, meaning it's always placed outside of a cultural norm or a social ethos. Always inhabits this gap between the time of upheaval that created it and the moment in which it's received to be born again. And so a monster always is sort of coming to us often on the cusp of some deep change in society, is kind of what that's saying. So you're looking at this idea of, again, the monster is symbolically something deeper, and it reflects fear, desire, anxiety, fantasy. So think about when we were doing semiotic analysis last week and we were analyzing the school desk, and we said, okay, the school desk is a part of education. There are a lot of other school desks like it. And then we started asking our questions about, well, what societal fears are somehow seen in this seemingly neutral school desk? What societal desires are seen? And we started to place that semiotic signified on that school desk. The monster can be read in much the same way. When looking at the monster's body, the monster is a reflection of social ethos and a reflection of culture. So, what is this monster representing or reflecting in terms of our social ethos and our society's fears, desires, anxieties, and fantasies? That's what this thesis number 1 means. Okay? The monster always escapes. So here's a quote from that one. In each of these vampire stories, because Cohen has just talked about vampires for a while in his writing, the monster returns in a slightly different clothing, each time to be read against contemporary social movements or a specific determining event. So essentially what this means is that some of those typical monsters, and I'm actually going to give you some more deep examples of this later. I'm going to talk through zombies and I'm going to talk through some vampire stuff. And then you'll kind of see how a monster can go away for a time and then be resurrected in a time and space where that monster has changed. It looks a little different, it acts a little different, its priorities are a little different because that monster is now reflecting a different societal moment. So the monster always escapes and is able to come back in a little bit different way. That's what this thesis means. The monster is the harbinger of category crisis. So basically, what this means, category crisis means as humans, we like to make order out of chaos. We like everything in our little boxes and our categories. We like to be able to identify and label things because we like our minds work in that way. Our minds work in that way where we want there to be order and not chaos. We want to be able to label, we want to be able to categorize. And the monster, because they're different, they refuse that. They refuse categorical classification. They can't be labeled. They can't be classified in our nice and neat little boxes. So this quote says, this refusal to participate in the classificatory order of things is true of monsters generally. They are disturbing hybrids whose externally incoherent bodies resist attempts to include them in any systematic structure or structuration. Their bodies resist that categorization. And so the monster is dangerous. They're a form suspended between forms that threatens to smash those distinctions. We don't want something going through all of those nice, neat boxes in our head and just smashing all those walls down. And that's what monsters threaten to do. Look at these big vocabulary words. Because of its ontological liminality, what do those words mean? Think about ontological for a second. Remember, an ontological question is a question related to existence in a way, related to if something exists and how we know it does. So, ontological in this context basically means because of the fact that it exists. Okay, so ontological means the fact that it exists, and then liminality in this sense, for something to be liminal, it's caught between a threshold. It's like if you had 1 foot inside the threshold of a door and you had 1 foot outside the threshold of the door. That would be considered you being in a liminal space. You're neither in nor out. You're liminal. And so it's this in-between state. So because the monster exists in a liminality, in an in-between state, the monster notoriously appears at times of crisis in our society as a kind of third term that problematizes the clash of extremes, that which questions binary thinking and introduces a crisis. So essentially, if you look at the world that we live in, you see a lot of binary thinking that is either morphing and changing, or we've already morphed and changed it, or we still need to morph and change it. One good example of this, sorry, school sounds. One good example of this is like binary thinking means you're either a boy or a girl. You're either heterosexual or homosexual. Those are the type of binary thinking thing. You're either a human or an animal, which obviously we know that humans are animals now, but back in the day, they didn't believe that and they struggled with that idea of breaking down the binary of human animal. You're either Republican or Democrat, right? So we have these binaries, and when society is entering into a place of crisis with those binaries, like, oh, maybe it's not either one thing or the other thing. Oftentimes, a monster will come forward and sort of represent that crisis and represent this idea, this challenge of a binary thinking. This monsters, they're not easily categorized. They exist in liminality or in in-between spaces. They're hybrids, sometimes both shelter and warning at once. And that's why they're so disturbing to our brains who like to make order out of chaos. And so that is thesis number 3. This is one of my favorites. The monster dwells at the gates of difference. So basically, what this means is that it represents this difference, and it dwells at the gates of that difference, and says whether or not we're going to be able to pass through, um, to really sort of accepting that difference. And so here's a quote to think about: representing an anterior culture as monstrous justifies its displacement or extermination by rendering the act heroic. So this is an example that Cohen uses in his work. In the United States, for example, Native Americans were presented to the Western Europeans coming over as unredeemable savages, just evil animals. So that Western Europeans were justified in coming in, and Cohen says, so that the powerful political marching of manifest destiny could push westward with disregard. So we want this land, right? And so there were two ways that Western Europeans described it: either, oh, it's empty land and it's just there for the taking, and they just ignored the fact that there were people actually there inhabiting the land. Or once it became a question, like, well, wait, this isn't uninhabited land. There are these people here. So then it became well, those aren't people. Those are monsters. Those are unredeemable savages. They're animals. They cannot be saved. They're so different. And so that's where these dwells at the gates of different. We put up those difference walls in order to justify. Humans often monster things in order to justify their extermination and justify our ability to destroy them. Hitler did it as well. He used those Germanic mythologies, and he dehumanized Jews in order to justify extermination. And some of the ways that they were dehumanized was they were vermin or they were rats. Those were two of the most popular names that Hitler used in his propaganda. They were rats and they were vermin. Both of those things we could then justify through that dehumanization and through that monstrous um, concept. We could other them and make them different enough to justify exterminating them. You hear some of that rhetoric even in politics today. You hear about things like the people, let's say people coming in from Mexico. You hear politicians saying things like they're all criminals, rapists, the worst of the worst, soulless. Same with Middle Eastern people that that might have connections to terrorist groups. We effectively them. And of course, are there some people coming over the border that are probably criminals or doing those things? Absolutely. But instead of individually identifying them, the rhetoric has been, let's generalize all of these people so that we can monster them, and then therefore we can lock them and their kids in cages, and that's okay because they're different and they're monstered, um, and they're unredeemable. Okay. Another example here, often these differences then are quickly moralized, sort of in the example like I just told you. Um, People coming over from Mexico are doing wrong things. And so moralized means it's made into like a right or wrong thing. And so this old example, and this is from, I think this is from the 1400s, I think, is what Cohen says, but he says these differences are quickly moralized. Paulinus of Nola, a wealthy landowner turned early church homilist, explained that the Ethiopians, who were African black people, had been scorched by sin and vice rather than by the sun. So before this, the rhetoric, and Cohen explains this, the rhetoric was that these people from Africa, these people from Ethiopia, were black just because the sun was so much stronger in that area. Well, then, when people wanted to start colonizing, when people wanted to start taking over those spaces, they had to monster those people in order to justify exterminating them. So instead of Ethiopians just being darkened by the sun, they were dark, they were black because their hearts were black. because they were sinful and they were vengeful, and that is why their skin was black. And so, therefore, we can justify killing them, um, dehumanizing them, and taking what was previously theirs as our own. So, this monster theory, I think, is really important for us to understand. This idea that we will monster something, or that sometimes people will, societies will. And when I say we, I mean societies. Societies and cultures will monster something or other something that's different, um, for multiple reasons. But a lot of times it has to do with the ability then to destroy or take life in some way. Okay, good. Okay, the other thing the monster does is it polices the borders of the possible. Okay, so what this means essentially, is that the monster shows a society what lines cannot be crossed and what is forbidden. Okay, so here's the quote: every monster is a double narrative, living two stories, one that describes how the monster came to be, and another, its testimony detailing what cultural use the monster serves. Within that, the monster of prohibition, so a monster that says you can't cross these lines. Prohibition says this is not allowed, right? Like you think about alcohol prohibition in the 1920s. This is not allowed. We're outlawing alcohol, right? So the monster of prohibition exists to demarcate or mark out the bonds that hold together that system of relations we call culture. So essentially, um, we have this culture, and everybody within this little bubble, right, is a part of our culture. And these are the things that you can do, and these are the things that you cannot do within our little bubble. And the monsters over there, because they're not doing these things and they're not adhering to the cultural norms or societal ethos, they're choosing to be outcast. And so essentially, what they show us, what the monster then shows us as a society, is what we are allowed to do and what we are not allowed to do. They show us those borders, they call horde attention to the borders that cannot, must not be crossed. Okay? They call attention to those borders. If you cross that border, if you remove yourself from that bubble, you're out there. Now you are monstered, right? So it gives, it polices those borders of what's possible in a social ethos and what's not possible in a social ethos. And I'll give you some examples of kind of where that came in some in history when we talk about zombies and vampires. Fear of monsters is really a kind of desire. I love this one because we're thinking about our bubble, right? And we're thinking about, oh, the monsters out there. They don't fall into our cultural bubble. They're not doing what society says that they're supposed to do, and so they're monsters. They're out there. They're different. They're over there. They're across the border. They've crossed that line. Um, and now they're at a point of no return. But this thesis, we start to look and we think, wait a second. Well, I wonder what it would be like over there if we didn't have these rules and these limitations and the I can do this and I can't do that and I can't cross these lines. They're free of all of that. That's interesting. I wonder what it would be like to be free of all of that. And so the fear of the monster for being outside the bubble almost can sometimes turn in to a really a kind of desire and envy for that freedom. It says we distrust and loathe the monster because they're outside our bubble, but at the same time we envy its freedom and perhaps its sublime despair. Sometimes even its loneliness we envy, the ability to just to really rule itself, judge itself, to not be ruled and judged by the limitations of society. The monsters serve as secondary bodies that we can almost live vicariously through, thinking about, ooh, what it would be like if I could do all these things. I can try to live vicariously through the monster. They serve as secondary bodies through which possibilities of other genders, other sexual practices, and other social customs can kind of be explored. Well, what would it be like? And so monsters can kind of show people, well, this is what it might be like outside the limitations of the bubble. they still police the border. So know that if you try to cross that border, you're going to be monstered too. But maybe we can kind of live through vicariously through their freedom and see what it might be like. The monster stands at the threshold of becoming. This was that short section at the end of Cohen's writing, and it just says, and when they come back, because they escape and come back, they always ask us to reevaluate our own cultural assumptions about race, gender, sexuality, our perception of difference, our tolerance toward its expression. Monsters ask us why we created them, because obviously monsters are they're coming from someone's creative mind. And Jung would say they come from the creative collective unconscious. Monsters come out of this societal space. And what they do, and one of the functions that they serve is they ask us, well, why did you create me? What do you need to look at? What do you need to analyze about your social ethos that makes my presence necessary? Okay. Do you need to look, does your society need to look about how they view race? Does your society need to look at how they view gender, sexuality difference? Oftentimes, monsters serve as a warning, and they come and they're created out of a space where society wants to warn people that if they do this or that, these horrible things will happen. Um, but when you look at the monster with a little bit more distance, you can start to realize, well, what is it that we are really afraid of as a society that we really need to check our cultural assumptions on? And I'll show you some examples here moving forward. So let's talk about zombies. I put a lot of writing on this slide. One, to make sure I didn't miss anything important when I was telling you this, but also just for those people who maybe didn't get to sit through this lecture. But then I'm recording it anyway. Anyway, so zombies originally came from this space that I'm going to tell you about. So French colonialists, and I've mentioned a little bit about what colonialism is. But basically, what colonialism is when a more dominant society or a society that's choosing to be dominant comes in and dominates a society or a people in order to try to take the land, the resources, and to colonize that land as their own. So, Western Europeans and Europeans in general did this, right? So, we know that America came out of this, where Europeans came over and colonized America. And that's where, we talked about with the Native Americans, they had to monster those people in order to justify exterminating. And then French people were also doing this. So some French colonialists started colonizing and trying to take the resources and stuff in Haiti. But they would go first through Africa and they would pick up Black people and African people in order to enslave them. So they would go to Africa first, fight and capture these people, and then take them over to Haiti to work on the sugar plantations there. And this form of slavery was incredibly brutal. Many of these slaves only lasted a few years under these conditions because it was such hard slavery, brutal conditions. Um, and so basically, that would just lead to more people being captured and brought over. So, what started happening was then the Haitian slaves, so slaves in Haiti, believed that dying was actually a release. It was actually your ability to then be brought back to the African homeland and be free. But then a mythology started. Um, the mythology was that if the slave committed suicide, because a lot of them would then say, "Well, why are we living? I should just commit suicide." But the idea was that slaves who committed suicide would be trapped in sort of an undead space and be forced to skulk and live out their lives there in Haiti in the Hispaniola plantations for eternity, that you would be stuck there still in slavery, not really in your body, but not really, dead. So this undead slave, like wandering the earth, denied their own bodies and yet trapped inside them. So this idea of this soulless zombie. And that's where this idea of zombie came from originally. So ultimately, what happened with this situation in the French colonialists in Haiti? French colonialism ended in Haiti because the African slaves successfully rose up and fought their colonizers. This is one of the only situations in history where the slaves were able to successfully craft an uprising that where they would win. And so essentially what happened is that happened, and then some of that folklore stayed in the Haitian folklore, that there was this idea that slaves that had committed suicide were in this zombie state. And then it became sort of linked to voodoo, which became sort of a Haitian religion, and that zombies could be, or like dead slaves could be reanimated in order to be zombies by voodoo shamans. And so some of that became part of the Haitian folklore that basically stayed within folklore oral tradition for a little while after the French colonialists were um, were stopped, basically were beaten. So then what happened was this story was taken and sort of morphed by white people. So morphed by Western white and European people. They would take those cultural ideas of zombies from the Haitian folklore and really combine them with the demonization of the black body that already existed within white and European imagination, and they really created this scary monster other, this black zombie. Um, and then they created this cult of voodoo and called it like a Satanist religion and all this kind of stuff. So the whole thing became this demonic and evil thing, and that was partially what they blamed the successful uprising on, was this idea that they were being helped by supernatural evil forces and these zombies. And so part of their army were these zombies that were, and these voodoo priests. And we demonized the whole thing. Basically, white people, European people demonized this whole idea of zombies as evil and demonic. Um, so then we also started, the stories about um, Haitian people, Haiti in general. They're savages, they're cannibals. They have this horrible cult, voodoo, evil religion. Really, a lot of the evil, dark connotations we have to voodooism and Haitian um, culture comes from this space, from us demonizing them because of the successful uprising. And the oral tradition has brought this down and down. It wasn't that long, it was maybe 10 years ago. I was talking to a friend of mine that was talking about how um, there were people that went on a mission trip to Haiti, and they came back and they were talking all about how Haiti is just full of satanic forces and the devil is at work there and the land is just desolate and everything is just obviously penetrated by evil. It's not very long ago that rhetoric was still going on. There was still the demonization and monstering of that space. And so that's a really powerful piece of oral tradition and folklore that exists through this idea of zombies. So now, zombies through different time periods had looked a little bit differently, and I'll show you kind of what they look like. But now the idea of zombies has kind of come to a different space, but I think there are still some similarities we can harken back. So the idea now that we have of zombies, I think we get really from The Walking Dead as one of the most popular pictures of a zombie. Zombies have now become completely obsessed with devouring the meat of the living. And that can harken back to the idea that Haitian people, zombies, um, are cannibals, right? So they're obsessed with devouring the meat of the living. Goes straight back to those cliches of savages and cannibals. Many people still see zombies in a sense as a metaphor for being a slave. You are literally working yourself to death. I'm a zombie. I'm a slave to my phone. I'm a zombie. I'm a slave to my work. I'm a zombie at work, just going through the motions. Many people still have that connection with slavery and zombies, the monster. So you can kind of see how those historical ideas and that oral tradition in that folklore has still been carried through, even though the zombie looks a little bit different now than it did. So you see, here's what zombies looked like right after all of this. This is a post-colonialism zombie, a portrait. So this is an actual piece of art. The emblem of a nation haunted by the legacy of slavery and ever wary of its reinstitution. So this is from Haiti, what the first post-colonial zombie sort of looked like. Here's one of the first movies about zombies. So in this movie, which came out in 1932, Dracula's in it. So we also have vampires. So Bela Lugosi is a Dracula, a vampire, who uses the voodoo religion, who uses voodoo magic to bring people back to life and create an undead situation. However, there's a slavery aspect to it. He's bringing people back from the dead to be slaves, and so there's that going on. And then the interesting thing about this movie is it also hearkened to the fears at the time, and that is that white women can be corrupted by evil very easily, which is basically a mythology that has been passed through oral tradition literally since Adam and Eve, that the woman is able to be corrupted and therefore evil forces will seek to corrupt the woman. And if the woman follows her desires, she will be corrupted. And so you see that playing out as well in this. This came out not long after suffrage and the women's right to vote movement was going on. And so women are really trying to take some power, trying to say, hey, I'm fully human. I should have a voice and a say and some subjectivity. And many times monsters come up to show, hey, wait a minute. If you want to take some voice and some subjectivity, if you want to follow your desires, careful, because here's the border of the possible. And women, you're crossing that border of the possible, and now you're going to become monstered. And so this movie encapsulates kind of all of those different things. So here's the issue with this. I got to pull this over because my actual links that are in the PowerPoint are not working, and I put a work order in and it's just not working. So I'm just going to do it like this, you guys. So sorry that it looks a little off, but movie trailers have come a long way. So enjoy this.
From Haiti, land of the voodoo, comes the most infamous cult of all. Bela Lugosi as Murder Legendre.
I see death.
Master of the undead damned. The sinister power behind the white zombie.
Zombies? Yes, they are my servants.
This soul killer takes men from their graves to be his slaves. His instruments of terror, and now this fiend plots to possess a woman.
Only a pinpoint, Monsieur Beaumont, in a glass of wine, or perhaps a flower.
Keep it, monsieur. Keep it. You may change your mind.
Not dead? Are you mad? I saw her die. The doctor signed the certificate. I saw them bury her.
Captive in the borderland between life and death. Her brain drained of the life spark. The white zombie obeys the unholy commands of her demon master. as mindless creatures carry out his cursed will, terror explodes in horror and heartquake.
Zombie! Allez, allez!
Never eyes so evil, never powers so potent, never magic so black. Bela Dracula Lugosi as the master of the White Zombie.
Okay, there we are. So I just wanted to show that to you. So it kind of combines aspects um, of Bram Stoker's Dracula and also stories of zombies and folklore of zombies. And you heard it say from Haiti, voodoo. I think you could also look at it, just occurred to me that perhaps you could also see the white zombie, the female, as you could also see maybe the whole thing as a cautionary tale as far as monsters policing the border of what's possible. Maybe it's also caution to men, because it seemed like those men were wanting to control this woman. Maybe it is a cautionary tale to men to stop trying to control women and control their minds and control their actions. So that could be another way you might be able to read the white zombie culturally. Okay? Okay. So let's see. So this is what it's doing. I don't know why it's doing that. Let's move on. Okay. And this zombie then is a more culturally contemporary zombie. So I want you to look at how this zombie differs from the old sort of historical Haitian zombie. Black, typically the zombies in Haitian folklore would be black people. So the black body. So that's why it was so significant that this movie was white zombie, right? They didn't know it was like before that. There were no white bodies that could be zombified. But now, look at this. We can. And women, of course. But this is the more contemporary zombie. If you haven't seen this movie, it's World War Z. I want you to take a look at this zombie. And what I really also want you to see about this is I want you to watch this scene because it is really significant what the zombies are doing in this first scene, and I think it's symbolic, and we need to look at that zombie's body in this first scene and what they're doing and how they're moving and what's happening in the scene. I just want you to think about it as you're watching. Okay? I'm going to pause it for a second. So you have these people that are in this walled space, and this is actually Jerusalem. So you have these people singing. They sort of are having this moment of, despite what they know is going on out there, they're having this moment that's sort of harmonious and pure. And they're all in this space that they see to be safe in this holy city, okay, of Jerusalem. Okay, I'll stop us right there. There's a little more to it, but I will stop us. Okay, so going back to the beginning of this scene, what I want you to see and take a look at is what are the differences between the zombie that we saw um, or that we're accustomed to, even in Walking Dead. Why is this zombie different? I think one of the things that I often kind of want you to see through this zombie is one, this zombie is fast. This zombie is scary because this zombie is fast, and so therefore, there's just a lot less control. We don't have a lot of control over this zombie's body. We don't have a lot of ways to escape this zombie, or these zombies. Whereas, like in Walking Dead, it's a slower zombie, right? It's like here comes some zombies, and 10 minutes later it's like you need to start kind of figuring out like what you're going to do about these zombies, and then another 5 minutes later you're like, okay, execute plan, but like it takes them so long to get to you. But these zombies are fast, and they are like freaks of nature. They cannot be killed. They just swarm and come. And I think the swarming aspect is really important. What do you see in this first situation? I mean, even looking at the title right here, Zombies Over the Wall. What might this scene be trying to show in terms of maybe a societal, political fear of our time? What other circumstances do we see there being a wall coming into play in our society? I hope you're thinking of immigration at this point. I hope you're thinking about how these people in the holy city are safe, they're harmonious, they're secure, they're singing together, everything is great. And then what happens? The zombies form these two towers, swarming, and start coming over the wall. Um, we're letting him into this space. Um, and we're even drawing them into this space, maybe even with our own volume. So there are some deep symbolisms there that you could look at. Maybe this zombie's body is meant to reflect a societal fear that we have that if we allow immigrants to come into our country, our purity will somehow be tainted, or somehow we will be devoured. Our harmony will be devoured. And I think it harkens back to that idea that we have that rhetoric surrounding immigrants, and this othering and this monstering. And even though there is some truth in that, there are some people like um, terrorists that might want to come and do damage. The reality of the situation is most of the people that want to come into this country just want to do so to create a better life for themselves. But the fear that society has, and that many people have in society, is that we are being swarmed by these monsters that will devour us and our purity and our children, and we'll never be the same again. And so this is an interesting zombies body, and this scene in particular that I think um, has a lot of symbolic value. So let's see if we can move forward here. Okay, so that's about all I have on zombies. So I want to talk a little bit about vampires. I'm not going to talk as much about vampires, but this is one of the older Dracula movies. So we've got kind of Josie Grossi here. And then now over here, today's vampire looks a little bit more like Edward, and clearly there's a difference in those monsters. I want to kind of talk about those differences as well. So, in the beginnings of vampire folklore, it really came from like peasant or commoner villages in countries, specifically like Romania, but other European countries as well, who had monarchies and who were ruled by monarchies. But the vampire came within spaces where peasant people or common people there was a building desire to maybe rebel against the throne or rebel against the church, which kind of were seen as one and the same thing back then. And this idea that we don't have to do what they tell us all the time. And really, that's the cultural space that Dracula came out of. Vampire became a word in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1734, but tales of vampires had been being passed down through folklore and oral tradition. Until Most from the vampires, like I said, came from peasant villages. And some of what they would blame on vampires was like things that would happen that were strange. They would blame them on evil supernatural forces. So vampires are again like they're a symbol of the undead, that when you die you don't really die, which was scary back then. It became a reflection of what might happen when someone might rebel against the throne. This is what you might become if you try to rebel against the church or the throne. And so, like zombies throughout history, vampires had this otherness, and they would police the borders of the possible, and they stood at the gates of difference, and they had this otherness about them that served as a prohibition or a warning. It was seen as threatening, this otherness, because it was rebelling against the status quo. It was being other, and it basically we've been trained throughout time to fear that, to fear any rebellion against the status quo or any difference or otherness. And vampires were no exception. This is actually a real vampire hunting kit, a vintage one, obviously, from I think the early 19th century. So vampires in the Victorian age, when Dracula was published, he became Bram Stoker's Dracula became like the quintessential vampire that everything was kind of based off of, and vampires were defined by Dracula for a really long time. And then Gothic literature sort of also became defined by these Dracula-esque type characteristics. So things like gloomy settings, decaying ruins, like decaying castles and things like that. Always damsels in distress. Gothic literature always had a damsel, always romantic with a hero, supernatural monsters in there. But Dracula kind of came on the heels of the Gothic era, and in the Victorian age of literature was starting to happen. And so Dracula flirted with that line of Victorian literature as well, because it showed growing fears in society back at that time and during the Victorian era that there were consequences of sexual deviance, particularly in women, but also in homosexual men. It tried to show that border of, okay, if you're a woman, this is what you can't do sexually. If you're a man, this is what you can't do sexually. It tried to show the dangers and police that border of expressing female sexuality in general, giving into our animal nature. This was when right after like Darwinism came to be, and this idea that we're all animals and that we have this animal nature. We have to just keep stuffing and denying it because it's not holy and it's not morally pure. And especially women should always be pure and submissive and never like try to take ownership or empowerment in their sexuality. And homosexuality was, of course, like totally forbidden. And Dracula was really meant to show people how threatening those elements of sexual empowerment were to society. So basically, when these women in the novel, um, Lucy and all these other these characters, damsels in distress, when they would become vampires, when they would take on sort of this idea, they were like the Adam and Eve, right? They were like Eve, where they would eat of the apple in some way. They would be charmed by Dracula, they would be seduced, and they would allow themselves to be seduced by Dracula. And then what would happen is they would become vampires and they would become these ravenous beasts, just wanting to devour and fulfill their desires. And they would go after men, they prey on men and children, and they would just become these crazy people. And so this story, this monster meant to serve as a warning for women not to do that. However, vampires today are a little bit different. Um, Sexual empowerment for women and all kinds of different elements of sexuality. We're more inclusive now as a society, which is great, which it should be that way. But now vampires have returned and they sort of are starting to represent something else instead of that, oh, here's the border of what female sexuality and, other types of sexuality, here's the border you can't cross. Now vampires come and they ask some different questions, or they sort of reflect some different fears. So there's still an element of fear for women, especially when you're being seduced by the vampire, that even though women have come so far and they can sort of take charge of their own sexual empowerment, will we still be seduced by these evil or charmed by these evil, deadly forces? Has anybody, I mean, it's like, hello, has anybody watched Dateline or the Ted Bundy tapes that recently came out? We are obsessed as a society with CSI type stories, and a lot of them deal with men who seem normal and charm women and seduce them, and then we fall victim to that and get killed. It's not funny, but it's just funny that that story comes up so often. It's almost like a monomyth in our culture. And vampires are one of those monsters that come up and reflect that. They reflect, will we fall for someone deadly? Um, I mean, especially because when you look at Edward and Bella, I don't know how many Twilight fans I have in the house, but when you look at Edward and Bella, you see that Edward is not, yes, he's protective, but he's pretty intense in terms of he stalks her while she's sleeping. He's overly protective and domineering to a point that normal men should not be. Hear me, ladies. Normal men should not act like Edward, okay? He's domineering, he's controlling. And there's something in women, I think, that sometimes thinks that that's love. And so I think there's still this fear that this vampire, this domineering, controlling, protective, abusive stalker is still somehow going to charm us. And so there is some reflection of that fear. But instead of being scary monsters a lot, vampires now they become this desirable figure, and they're not necessarily sucking blood from humans anymore vindictively. They're getting their feedings done on animals, which seems so much more like inclusive and like okay. They're like vegetarians. Um, and so some people have argued that this actually reflects women's sexual empowerment, that women desire to make their own decisions about their bodies and their sexual gratification. So the modern day vampire reflects that ideology. Also, I think modern day vampires, we've become really obsessed with the immortality aspect of vampires. And I think today we are much more interested in how we can maybe live forever and transcend and be immortal. And so that's one of the aspects that really is a focal point of vampires today that we see. You see these vampires throughout time, and they've reflected and warned about different things. And so when you're in class, I'm going to have you do this. If you weren't in class, you can certainly do this, but you don't have to. It's just a good exercise in sort of putting some of these things into practice. So this is really long. I'm so sorry, you guys. I should have known that it was going to be this long. But I'm going to cut this off. This is just for you guys who aren't able to be in class this week. I hope you'll watch this lecture and feel a lot more equipped to write that analysis essay either semiotically analyzing a cultural object or perhaps a monster. I have heard that the new Dracula series on Netflix is really good and really has some good analysis that you can attach to it because of how this vampire presents itself. If you reflect that against our cultural fears, desires, ideologies right now. Okay? All right. Good luck. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you guys when I see you. Okay? Stay healthy.